Thank you so much, Gabriella, Jessa, and Marisa. So you've met the rest of my team now. Miyuyum, Nosun, Angela, Muni, DRC. I am a Hashimim, and our ancestral territories are in what's also known as Orange County, California. I'm coming to you from unceded Tongva homelands, known as Venice, California. And I also want to name that, as far as I'm aware, there are only two Tongva individuals who continue to own, quote unquote, own property in what's now known as Venice. And I'll bring that back in later in the talk, but that's relevant because I think one takeaway that I hope you all can have from this gathering is that Indigenous peoples are still and continue to be displaced from our homeland. And that's something important for all of you to keep in mind as you do the work that you do on behalf of water. So I'm the executive director and founder of Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples. We're located in Tongva homelands, and our mission is to build the capacity of Native nations and Indigenous peoples to protect sacred lands, waters, and cultures. I'm not going to go through our whole team's bios because you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint as part of the curriculum training afterwards, so you can see how fabulous everyone is soon. And I will turn it over to Roland to say a couple of words about tree people, and then we'll turn it back over to Jessa to get it started in section 1.
Hi, hello everyone. Sorry, I saw Jennifer, I saw your notification regarding getting Addie in. Working on that right now, sorry. Yes, so yeah, hi everyone. So we're doing introductions, correct, Angela? Sorry, I was trying to.
Oh yeah, just introduction, and then if you want to say a couple words about tree people, and then we'll turn it over to Jessica.
Of course. Okay, great. So hello, everyone. My name is Roland. I'm the Tribal Engagement Coordinator at Tree People. I'm also of the Hashiman people. So I've been helping organize these sessions. And so I want to thank all of you for joining. And I kind of wanted to just, Tree People has had the opportunity to join in and kind of help with, setting these up. And, so just to introduce us, I myself am Roland, and we also have amongst the Tree People group involved, we have Peter Massey, and we also have Ariel Whitson. So, and there's slides there for that we could share later.
Amanda's here too.
Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you. And Amanda.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the water culture and origin, providing Indigenous context. So we'll start with locating ourselves. The Los Angeles River is the river that we'll focus on today, and it stems from the waters of the Simi Hills and Santa Susana Mountains, and it also has tributaries streaming from the San Gabriel Mountains. This river was and is an important part of our life. It was an important means to travel. Our relatives, our ancestral relatives, would travel down the tributaries, travel up and down the river to visit other neighbors and relatives, and vice versa. This was basically our highway before we had the 5 freeway, right? It was also a rich food source. It was a gathering place for ceremonial purposes, as well as a place to gather basket materials and so much more. The Tongva families understood that fresh water was a necessity. Therefore, they contributed to a healthy ecosystem to sustain all life in and around the water for thousands of years. We understand water as a living entity even today. Water, as we know it, is an energy source. We're going to talk about life in the river, and then I'll ask you some questions. And I'd like to share that Indigenous people understand that the land, the waters, have always had its natural cleansing and healing systems. From the rocks and the pebbles, the sand and the plant roots, which contain energy, give the water healing qualities. But the rocks, pebbles, sand, dirt, and plant roots are also a natural cleansing system. The rocks, sand, roots, and water are a place for many species of life to thrive. When the damming occurred, it created stagnancy. The water's natural cleansing system was removed, causing the water to become easily infected with disease, such as deadly algae, and causing the natural life, such as fish, to die off. When contaminants are poured into the water, it also causes disease, causing death and harm to any living beings who rely on the water source. A lot of people find it hard to believe today, but in the time of the Los Angeles River's most abundance, the river contained salmon and trout, as well as many other life that the river sustained, and we then lived off of those foods as well. So we were big salmon people and trout people here in Los Angeles. And so one of the questions I want to ask for you, and I'll ask you to answer these in the chat if you feel called to, is what are some of the ways that you practice respecting water? And the next question is, can you describe what water as a living entity means to you? And then finally, can you describe what water as an energy source means to you? And we'll move on while you listen and type to speak of the relationships and the reciprocity. The relationships between plants, roots, rocks, pebbles, to the dirt, to the sand, and how they all tie into natural cleansing systems and work together was just expressed. Our people knew that vibration was an important part of life. Every form of life is vibrating and tuning into vibrations, causing different reactions. When one has good and loving intentions, they release good and loving vibrations outside of themselves. The intention of prayers going into paddling the riverways, bathing and drinking the energetically charged and natural systematically cleansed water, collecting food in or near the water, collecting materials for common uses, it was all a contributing factor to maintaining a healthy, vibrating ecosystem. We all sang to each other. The plants sang to us, the water sang to us, and we sang to them. And we kept the loving vibrations high and pure in this way. We all had good intention behind our actions and made sure to do our part in keeping one another healthy. Take only what you need has been a teaching we still live by today. When people came here with the intention to steal, kill, and take with malintent and bad vibrations, the healthy ecosystem as we knew it began to shift into the sick ecosystem we surround ourselves with today. It's not enough to talk about it like the partner who's sorry with promises to change tomorrow. It's beyond time to get back to the practices. Although we are far behind to revitalizing the practice of healthy relationship and reciprocity, if we continue to make excuses as if we could never get back there, meanwhile continuing to overindulge and overdevelop, we will surely completely devastate our homelands. And you know, when speaking of relationships and reciprocity with water, I need us all to understand the importance of fire, because we can't have one without the other in our world as we knew it and know it. They are both equally important to our nations. And I will pause and ask if anybody has any questions or reflections to go ahead and put in the box, or maybe one or two can unmute and share.
And while we're waiting for folks to come up with some questions, I can share some of the things in the chat here. I say hello to the water in my house every morning. I want water at my home to have purpose, so the energy has a place of impact. Respecting water to me shows up mostly as using only what I need and nothing more, and avoid polluting behaviors. I'm still learning how to experience water as a living being. It is a concept my life hasn't prepared me for. I deeply appreciate what it is to me and aspire to better appreciate what I am to it. I think a lot of us, are in that perspective, and that's why it's so important to have conversations like this with Indigenous leaders. I take a moment to appreciate the dirt, the water, and ask for permission. I thank the ocean every time I visit Earth. So if anyone else has any questions or thoughts and reflections on this first piece, now would be the time to share. And there's one final quote here that I think is great. Water as a living entity means that it doesn't just support life, but is living itself. And if it lives, it can die. If it lives, it can die, or can it die? Is it living when it is polluted or sold as a commodity? How do we change our mind to see water as living, even when it is bought and sold like soda, when it is treated like our landfills? Jessica, any care to respond to that last question in the chat?
Yeah, I think it's about tuning into ourselves and recognizing that, we all know that we can't live without water, but has anybody ever tried it? It's when you, as Indigenous people, we have ceremonies where we go 4 days without food and without water. And that's one of the ways to humble ourselves, to really understand the respect that we need to have for these relatives. Because when you go 4 days without water in a ceremonial way, when you take that first drink of water, you're going to love and appreciate that water like you never have before, and I think that's something that the majority of Americans do not get to experience, because we're so used to just turning on a tap and never questioning where this water comes from. So I think that's why a big number of us Indigenous folks that grew up in ceremony have that amount of respect and understanding. And those who are deeply involved in our ancestral ways, who know the origins of water, have that respect, but the majority don't. So I think it's about educating our young ones to have them be taught, a lot of these teachings, and know where their water comes from, instead of having the idea and mindset that it just comes when you hit the H or the C, but rather exactly where it comes from, and how to have a living relationship with it. And that all comes back to connecting with self and connecting to the land and the water.
Thank you for that. I'll just say one final reflection on that piece and then turn it over to Gabriella for her section. But I think Drew, whose comment that is, you have it right there in the question, is if it's alive, it can die. And I think all of us treat life differently than we treat an inanimate object, right? There's a certain care and caution and mindfulness that we all try to have when we're dealing with a living being. And so I think in that right there, by asking the question, can it die? And if the answer is yes, then we all will be more careful and respectful with water and our understanding of it as we plan and engage in these other relationships in the settler colonial space. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Gabriella to take us off into the next section.
Hello again, everyone. So I'm going to be discussing capitalism, settler colonialism, commodification, and contamination with all of you. I think, throughout this section, I'm going to be showing clips from the video that we shared with you, as well as a film called The Aqueduct Between Us, to sort of bring into perspective like how these 4 C's have affected Indigenous people and everyone who lives in LA County. So I'm going to start with the aqueduct between us. It began its life as a panel discussion centering like the Department of Water and Power's history of extractive water practices in the Owens Valley. The film was produced over the course of 2 years by both Annie and Isaiah Mendoza. There was a few other people who helped them, and there's a bunch of people in the film that shared amazing things. and it shared the experience of the Tongva and Paiute people alike. The Isaiah, all of this on this slide is taken directly from Isaiah, who was the producer and editor of this film. I'm going to share a little section with all of you, and then I'm going to keep on talking after that.
What we call our homeland is Payahunaru.
It's the place of flowing water. I would venture to say that most people coming up into the Owens Valley from Los Angeles would not really have that same descriptor to call this place. But it is what our people called it because it was a place of flowing water.
Our word for water is Paya. Paya is culturally significant to us because it's life. We believe it's a life force. We believe it is life in itself.
To us, water's sacred. We've always known that because when we spread our water, we created life.
We had the river running down at a huge lake at the bottom that they now call Owens Lake. We called it Patsiata. There was just this abundance of resources. It's not only food, it's your clothing, it's your house, it's your medicine, it's your basket material, everything, and it all depends on that water.
So that little clip I chose because it kind of just points out all of the C's that we're talking about: the colonialism, the contamination, the capitalism, and the commodification. That water was sort of seen as a commodity and just taken from the Paiute people and taken to LA. And the Paiute people were just left without water. And it's kind of like, you have to think about it, how does the movement of water from one place to another affect everyone in general? I'm gonna go ahead and move on.
What we call our
Okay, so this one, this is the film that we shared with all of you, or that Roland sent out to you in email. It's Indigenous Voices on Sacred Waters. The SPI media team, with the help of Tree People, were able to put this film together over the course of hundreds of hours. They spent time filming, producing, and editing this film that shares the perspectives of Tongva, Ahashiman, Chumash, and Tataviam relatives. I'm gonna go ahead and play the little clip, and then I'll keep on talking.
When these organizations and state agencies recognize that we are part of the conversation and not just a number in the back, it makes it really meaningful because it gets rid of that erasure factor. It's like saying, yes, you're here, you exist, and we want to hear what you have to say. But it also allows for Indigenous people to start to feel more comfortable talking to these agencies who have alienated them for so long, who have taken their land, who have done all of these things that have negatively impacted Indigenous people. It makes it hard because there's a lot of negative feelings towards these agencies because of all of that happened in the past. But that shouldn't stop these agencies from still trying to reach out and include us in the conversation.
But as we've been experiencing in reality, what this means for some state agencies is invite us to a tribal consultation meeting or roundtable and then check the box and call it a day.
We should be beyond the point where agencies think that all they have to do is sit in a room and let us tell them what we want to say, and then they can go off and do what they plan to do in the first place.
So before it cut off Tony there, she was saying before they planned to do what they were originally going to do in the first place. And that section is really important because a lot of us as Indigenous people have a disconnect from state agencies because of the way that water has been commodified by these agencies. It's sort of seen as just a thing that exists and we take it from here and it shows up in our house somehow miraculously. And I think a lot of the work that all of us in this group here do is sort of bring awareness to the fact that that water does not just magically appear. It comes from a place and it's cleaned in a certain way, and it's just bringing to light to the importance of where it's coming from. State agencies play an important role in the connection between water and people because they're the ones who have that capacity to educate the public about where this water is coming from, how this water is flowing into their homes. Allowing Indigenous people, especially those from local tribes, to have co-management opportunities allows the public to see that Indigenous people are not a thing of the past, and that their relationship with water still exists and is still really important. Meaningful consultation and co-management is so much more important than the performative kind that a lot of current agencies currently engage in. And we'll go on to talk about allyship and appropriation and performative allyship later on in this presentation. But meaningful allyship is just what allows tribes to begin to trust these organizations again, because there's a lot of times where tribes have just been burned and they're like, oh, we took you, or they were taken in and like used for a few words and then just thrown back out there. And it's like, was that really beneficial to anyone in any way? Or was it just kind of like performative, like I was saying before? So the focus on this section is the concretization of the river. So that would sort of tie into colonialism, capitalism, as well as contamination. And I'm going to go ahead and let Jessa and Honor say a few things first.
And the channelization that they have contributed to is part of why we don't have our salmon and our freshwater relatives.
I mean, I would like to be more connected with my homelands, but with all the concrete and everything, it just doesn't feel right at all.
So that's kind of the feeling that a lot of Indigenous people have in regards to the LA River, as well as the aqueduct. We can't really have a connection to the water because nobody really sees it as water anymore. I mean, Indigenous people still see it as the LA, like being water and alive, but a lot of the general public just see it, oh, like, look, the concrete has water on it today. So it's just a different perspective. The river has been denaturalized for the benefit of settlers, and that's way prior to our time. So it's hard too, because a lot of that responsibility falls on us, the generation that's alive today, to figure out what the heck are we going to do to either reverse this or fix things, a lot of things that we had no control over in the first place. An effort to stop yearly flooding has disrupted the nature and has led many native plants and animals to disappear from the LA River. As Jessa mentioned prior, there was salmon and trout that just would swim freely there, and we would have a source of food. And the concretization of the river and settlement along the river in a very taking way, extractive way, that's the word, has led to those things disappearing. The concrete there also creates a disconnect between the people of LA and the river, because they no longer see it as a body of water, they just see it as a piece of infrastructure. Like I was saying before, I know like when I was younger, used to see the LA River and just be like, hey, look, it has a little bit of water in it today. Whereas that used to have water flowing in it freely prior to being concretized. And
the channel.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to a clip from the aqueduct between us, and it's sort of discussing the outsourcing of water, which I've mentioned in a few times in the slides before. So I'll go ahead and play the video, and then I'll come back and talk to everyone.
Representatives of the city of Los Angeles entered the city in arguably very shiesty ways. They very much came in hidden, disguised as local new families that were moving, you know, and buying up land as though they were going to come and live here. Only later on did the local people find out that they were under the guise of a much bigger plan and agenda.
For 1895, Mulholland, Eaton, and Lippincott come here, but they wanted water for LA because LA outgrew the LA River. Once it hit the population of 250,000 people, they knew that they needed more water for LA to get bigger. And that's where they got the idea of building LA Aqueduct.
In 1904, William Mulholland and Fred Eaton began purchasing land in the Owens Valley. In 1905, there was a bond that the city of Los Angeles approved to construct the aqueduct, so it all happened rather quickly. The construction began in 1908, and it was completed in 1913, I believe. And then during that same time period, in 1912, President Taft set aside over 67,000 acres for possible reservation for the Indians.
Lands that were set aside for us were higher up on the fan, and really were key places for moving water, which is why they really wanted those lands for Los Angeles to be able to control. And LA in the 30s did a series of reports to document the conditions of the people that were living here. The title of it says it all. We were the Indian problem.
So I put this section in here because I felt that it was important to know that that this type of colonization was still happening, I think, pretty late on in the settlement of America, that it's kind of hard to keep in context of how recent a lot of the places that we're living in have been colonized or have been sort of overtaken by the idea of manifest destiny, and how that's impacted a lot of the reasons as to why some of us are here or were born on this land. Another thing that they mentioned that was really important was the fact that they were moved from these areas onto different reservations or different plots of land, so that these agencies could have complete control over the way that the water was moving, without the Indian problem being there to be like, hey, you guys, we need that water for this. We're living off of this water. They just basically moved them and put them over somewhere else and said, we're gonna build this aqueduct so that the water gets to the LA. So outsourcing water is basically water coming from places different than other than its original source. Forced movement of water for the benefit of settlers. It is the forced movement of water for the benefit of settlers and has allowed more people to settle in LA. Outsourcing of water is an important thing to keep in mind today as reservoirs are drying up. I think one of the ones that's most vivid in our minds right now is the Colorado River and Lake Mead, how that's a source of water for a lot of the desert area here in the US, and it's running out of water. The Colorado River isn't even running into Mexico anymore. So the people who needed that, the indigenous people who still live on the river today, don't have access to the things that they used to have access to, like the fish and the water, because the river doesn't run that far anymore. I think as we move the water to us, it's important to keep in mind, more often than not, we are taking it from someone else who needs it. As the water moves, there's people fighting over who it's going to go to. There's people fighting for their own ability to maintain the water on their own lands. So it's really hard, because in this time of drought, I think we're really even more aware of the way that the water is moving and being forced to move, and how it's affecting people other than ourselves.
Representative.
So the last thing I want to share with you all is, where does your water come from? It's important to know where your water comes from so that you can properly show respect to the water itself and be aware of the importance of water. If you don't really care where your water is coming from, it's kind of, there's a disconnect there. You're like, well, it's just flowing into my home. It's never going to stop. When in reality, it's kind of, we have to think about it in the sense that because there's water flowing into our homes now, there's not water flowing into someone else's home further down the river, if that makes sense. So just keep in mind that the river and the water is a living entity, and it's not willingly flowing into your home. It's being forced to do so because of infrastructure that's already in place. And reconnection with water will help you understand why the water itself is sacred and not something that we should be wasting or taking or necessarily moving from one place to another. And I'm gonna let Charlie Sepulveda speak for the end of this section, and then we'll move on to questions.
If you go into somebody else's home, you're a guest, and you treat their home in a manner that's respectful. Instead of saying, well, no, I don't agree with the way that this is set up. You know, I want to transform your house because it's not beneficial to me. That's exactly what the colonizers have done in California. They've looked at our home and said, this is not beneficial, the way things are set up, the way that the river floods yearly. So we need to transform it. We need to change it in order for it to be beneficial for us. So the answer is to change our entire perspective of the environment, to view ourselves as guests to the land. That we're only here for a small, incredibly small time on this planet. Even as the race of human beings, we're only here for a small time on this planet. And the world will transform. And it's always been in transformation. And the solution is that we can be guests of the land, that we can be guests of the tribal nations, that we don't have to force either into submission, that they can exist on their own, that the land has power, the land has spirit, and that we should take that into consideration with what we do, the way we live.
With that, I open the floor to questions. If you have anything you want to say, you can go ahead and say it in the chat, or you can go ahead and raise your hand. But yeah, thank you for listening to me.
Can we take questions from the phone?
Yes.
So hi, I'm Melina Watson. I'm one of the watershed coordinators. I know a lot of First Nation peoples have been involved in processes of removing dams and creek restoration. Do you have any thoughts on the role of why First Nation people prioritize that and how we might consider that as we move forward? Does that make sense, or can you hear me?
I can hear you. I was just, you were saying why Indigenous people prioritize that, or?
I was saying I have been impressed in a number of different locations where there was dam removal for fish migration or creek restoration for the purposes of creek restoration by the leadership of First Nation peoples in this process. And I was wondering on if you had any thoughts about the value of this or the relevance of this in the context of Los Angeles County. I don't know.
Angela, would you be willing to take this?
Sure. I didn't want to step on your toes, but yeah, I think the distinction that's important with LA County is that there are no federally recognized tribal nations in LA County, and that makes a difference. We'll get to this more after the break when we talk about sovereignty and federal Indian law and these kinds of things. But I think, you know, so one, tribes that are federally recognized have more jurisdictional power relative to non-federally recognized tribes. And what that means, I think, particularly in LA County, and here's a perfect example. You have the LA River Master Plan, the 3,000-page document, the response to comments just came out, billions of dollars flowing into the so-called rehabilitation or restoration of the LA River. And yet, even though Tonga people were unanimous in their desire to be involved and be on the steering committee for the planning of that, no Tonga person was ever appointed to that steering committee. And that shows the disconnect between local agencies not at all taken seriously. So they're not even at the point where they think that tribes should have a right to be at the table in places like LA County. When you look at the LA County, the most recent iteration of the local integrated regional water management plan, I don't even know that it mentions Tonga people, let alone gets into, you know, depth about why, you know, things like free, prior, and informed consent. And so I know for a fact, based on all of these interviews that we've done, that Tonga people and other local tribal people feel very strongly about decanalizing and deconcretizing rivers. We had a series of listening sessions and went through this whole tribal water needs assessment in Santa Ana for the Wanawanita, the Santa Ana River as well. And as in LA, also with the upper Santa Clara River, the upper LA River region, tribes overwhelmingly, tribal participants said that deconcretizing the river and rehabilitating and restoring the natural habitat was the #1 priority. The disconnect is in whether or not the agencies are listening to tribes and taking that seriously. And at least in the context of the LA River Master Plan, I would say they're not taking that seriously. If you have a microscope and can look at their responses to the 2,000 page document and comments, you'll see that even when we raised the issue of lack of meaningful engagement with Tonga and other local tribal people, their response was just many Indigenous people participated in the process. They didn't even see fit to name which Indigenous nations or peoples participated. And so those are some of the reasons why I think that you're not seeing front and center that kind of action that you see in other places. It's certainly not for lack of desire on the part of the local tribes, but it's lack of agency respect for those desires on behalf of local tribal people. And I don't know if anyone else from SPI's team wants to weigh in on that question either.
Wow, that was very enlightening. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for asking the question. It's important to ask these questions, and there are no stupid questions. Part of the issue with colonization is that the goal is to perpetuate the erasure of Indigenous nations, and so all of us are struggling against that. And so please, any questions you have, this is definitely the opportunity with this group of experts to let us know what questions you have, and we can enter into a conversation.
Well, to close out, if you have any interest in commenting on issues of the North Santa Monica Bay, I'd love to connect with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Definitely, we'll do that. Our contact info is at the end of the presentation. Michaela,
Thank
you have a...
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for just taking the time to share and do this training with us. I think it's incredibly important to our work. And, you mentioned kind of this experience that you had, with the LA River Master Plan. And I was really riveted by the video that you shared in advance of this training. And I was curious, one is having a tribal seat or Indigenous representation on the various WASC, the watershed area steering committees of the Safe Clean Water program. Is that something that's of interest or would be of interest? I mean, I think sharing these perspectives are so important, and honestly, only you as Indigenous people can share those perspectives. No one else can represent that for you. So I'm curious if that's something that is a desire, one, or would be of interest. And then two, I also question a little bit, like, there's so much happening in the water world, so many different agencies, so many different initiatives from the state to the county, or what have you. And, I also wonder in what ways or what support do you need to increase maybe capacity to serve in those ways?
Yeah, thank you for those great questions. I think, what kind of support we need, a couple of ways that nonprofits and agencies can be allies is, particularly for organizations that are involved in sort of watershed management planning, everybody's got to do a budget, right? Those budgets vary from institution to institution. But one thing I would encourage everyone to do is go back to your organizations and audit, do a line item audit of the annual budget. Where in the budget is there specific funding allocated to support local tribal involvement in these spaces? Because that, for those folks that were able to watch the video, for me, one of the most powerful moments in that video is Alan Salazar saying there are 800 Tataviam people and not one of us is wealthy. In my experience, a lot of times agencies forget that. I think, in part because of some of the economic success of neighboring federally recognized tribes with gaming industries. There's a misconception in places like LA that Native people are wealthy or have money. And the reality is that for those tribal nations on whose lands LA County is built, Alan Salazar is absolutely right. You know, Indigenous people are BIPOC people as well, and just as other BIPOC people have been marginalized and economically exploited, so have our communities. And so that means, you know, one, where are the resources? The other piece of that that's important that I like to share with folks is a decolonizing of the hierarchy of value. And by that, I mean, you know, folks will pay an attorney top dollar, $500 an hour, or a water quality hydrologist expert or an engineer, right? There are all these disciplines related to water that entities prioritize and are willing to pay for those services. But when it comes to tribal community members, that sort of dedication or willingness to resource tribal knowledge is often missing. And one example I like to give is one of our elders and board members, Richard Bugbee, who's Payom Pochum Lucenio, but he was trained by a Kumeyaay elder, you know, and Richard's in his 70s. And so, you know, the woman who trained him was in her 70s when she trained him. And Richard speaks, you know, 3 or 4 California Native languages. And his learning of those languages comes directly from being taught about the plants, the native plants. That kind of knowledge, there's not an attorney in the world. There's attorneys are a dime a dozen. But Richard Bugbee is the only person that has that kind of knowledge. And so, you know, agencies and organizations should do an audit of their budgets. Where is funding allocated to support tribes? The other piece of what you said that I want to respond to and give other folks at SPI an opportunity to respond before we take a break is on capacity, right? So the disconnect also is that Indigenous peoples have been so forgotten and not included in any, like the Measure W water stuff, all the agencies, not a whisper to tribes, right, until the last year. So we had no idea what that was. So the gap that tribal folks have to bridge in terms of readiness to be able to serve in these spaces and be decision makers is pretty extreme. And so it's not just a matter of resourcing people, Indigenous people, you know, within your organization, but it's also about thinking bigger. How can we resource Indigenous nations and their tribal members to get the training that they need so that they can feel empowered to serve in these positions? And I will stop there with a cliffhanger to say that SPI is working with some other local organizations to hopefully develop a local Indigenous water institute to address these kinds of issues. So I'll pause there and see if anyone else wants to weigh in on this before we break.
Ariel, did you want to share?
I do, but not unless anyone else from SPI wants to go first. So I'll leave that space first. Anybody?
I'll just briefly say one of the other struggles with this is also identifying the difference between federally recognized Native nations versus unfederally recognized Native nations. And so even amongst federally recognized nations and regular typical Americans is if we're not federally recognized, we're seen as, well, then you're not Indian. And that's a huge mistake that needs to be changed. And oftentimes people do consider that we died out in the 1800s and are no longer in existence. But I'm here to tell you that is a fabrication. And I will go ahead and let you go, Ariel.
Thank you, Jessa, for sharing that. I just wanted to add a couple of other things that it truly is relooking to me at your budget and the way that you're doing things and asking that question first instead of last is a huge thing. Second, are you creating a space that's safe and okay to bring that voice to the table? Because I've seen it happen so many times. Like you said, Gabriella, it's come to the table and then we don't listen and then we do what we want anyways, right? So how are you rethinking how you're creating a space to actually take feedback and act on it, right? And also elevate the voices in the room of Indigenous and tribal peoples. And the last thing I'll say too is it's about relationship building as you would any other, you know, entity, person you work with, but it's deeper than that. And so it's, you know, going beyond the surface level. I guess that speaks back to what I just said is so important, you know, There's all this history and you have to acknowledge it and come at the table and build relationships in an authentic way, in the same way that we do as community organizers and watershed coordinators. It's really important that that space be created that is safe, and that there's that relationship building as well.
Thank you for that, Ariel. I saw that Mike has a question about resources about Native nations, peoples, and communities that were displaced elsewhere to California. So I'll try to weave that into my section of the talk, and then I'm sure we can come up with some resources. There's actually, sadly, in my mind, far more resources about Native folks not from here who were relocated to here than there are about the people whose actual homeland this is. So with that, we'll pause. It's 2:32. Please come back at 2:37. We had to put the break before my talk, so you guys will do some moving and not be bored to tears when you learn all of these legal things. So take a break and get some water and come back at 2:37. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. If I can just get some thumbs up so that I know I'm not talking to a blank screen, which I did for an entire year while I taught during COVID. Just some thumbs up so they know to get started. Okay, looks like we have a critical mass of thumbs. Okay, let's get going. So now we're gonna get into some of the context, historical context, and laws and policies related to government-to-government consultation, tribal sovereignty, and water. If we can go on to the next slide. I always like to start this honoring our ancestors and elders. And I think this is really important, especially in the context of the kind of work that you all do. Because for many of us, we don't get involved in environmental and water justice work for the heck of it, right? It's a passion for people. And for many people, it's a lifelong engagement. It's a career that spans many decades. And that is definitely a huge investment. But I like to start with this slide to honor my ancestors and also to acknowledge that sadly, the majority of the people in these photos are no longer living. Many of them have passed on. And these are the people that I learned from my tribal community and from other tribal communities. And they had this water advocacy engagement because of what their relatives shared with them and put them on this path. So I say all that to say, for as long as you all have been doing this work, know that the Indigenous peoples you're working with have been doing it for lifetimes. And that means two things. It means, one, the level of investment is great from Indigenous people, and two, the level of expertise and knowledge that can be shared with you all so that we all benefit is extreme, in the sense that Native nations have been investing in and planning and engaging with our waters for thousands of years, and that's an expertise that shouldn't be overlooked. Next slide, please. And so I always like to start with this grounding, thanks to what Gabriella shared as well, but this is another visual of just how many Native nations there are in what's now known as California. You can go on to the next slide. And this is the route that colonization took. So California experienced 3 waves of colonization from Spain, Mexico, and then the United States. What's significant about this route as it relates specifically to Los Angeles County is that along the route that colonization took, there are very few federally recognized tribes. The majority of Native nations who were hit first and hardest by this first level of colonization are not federally recognized. And that gets into a lot of the issues that I discussed in the Q&A earlier. Next slide. This slide, is always challenging for me to show. I tend to not, like to show hate speech, but it's important here. And it's important because it's contemporary. And that is another thing that I think often folks don't understand, and I think is a critical piece of being a good ally to Indigenous peoples. Doctrine of discovery is really the root of white supremacist culture and institutional racism in the United States. You see in the papal bulls from 1452 that the Pope directed the king to capture, vanquish, subdue, and enslave, and put them into perpetual slavery and take all their possessions and property. That enslavement and theft of possessions and property is really what underlied and justified the transatlantic slave trade and the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples. And we saw that new manifestation of doctrine of discovery in the United States narrative about itself. We've all familiar with the term manifest destiny. The photo in the center was a photo taken on the campus of Chapman University in shared Ahashimim and Tonga ancestral homelands. And it was taken while I was teaching an environmental justice course there, the first time that Chapman had ever offered an environmental justice course. And it was taught by someone from the Native Nation whose land the university is on. I received this photo in my email account from the university because these were plastered all over campus. And this was in 2020. And so I want to share that with people because I think it's important for everyone to understand these racist doctrines are not just a product of the past. They're very much alive and well and operating as white supremacist culture in our ancestral homelands today. Next slide, please. This is the financials of California's financed attempted genocide. These tables document how much money private militias spent to exterminate California Indians. And in the second column is the amount of money that the state of California reimbursed those private militias. And in the third column is the amount of money that the United States government then reimbursed the state. That's important for these conversations around how agencies and entities interact with tribes around water, because there was a collusion of private individuals, the state, and the federal government to exterminate us. And that history is relatively recent. Next slide, please. These are some of the laws that were passed in the 1850s after California became part of the United States. And these were the laws that allowed for the enslavement of California Indians. What's important to note here is that even though these laws were passed in the 1850s, many of them weren't eradicated legally from the books until the early 1900s. And that means that, there are people alive today who had relatives that were bound by these laws. So again, it's much more recent in time than people often want to consider. Next slide, please. This is a quote from one of STI's board members, tribal elder, artist, writer, and activist, that I think, again, is important for folks locally to understand. While other people may see, cities, building structures, places like Los Angeles, for Indigenous people, it's still our meadows, valleys, streams, and sacred sites. And so it's important to be mindful and keep in mind those perspectives as you do this work. Next slide, please. I want to talk for a minute about self-determination and tribal sovereignty. Often we hear, and it's a huge pet peeve of mine, as I know it is for others on our team, we often hear agencies and nonprofits say, oh, well, yeah, tribes are stakeholders. Let's bring the tribal stakeholders into the conversation. Tribal nations never have been, nor will we ever be, stakeholders. Tribal nations are nations. They're sovereign nations with whom, state and in some instances, federal entities owe a duty to consult. And so I want to talk about these different terms here. Indigenous self-determination, I like the definition from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which we'll get into in a moment. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Now, tribal sovereignty is a little bit different. There are many definitions for tribal sovereignty. This one comes from Indigenous Environmental Network, which is one of the oldest and far-reaching grassroots Indigenous environmental justice works in the country. In fact, Indigenous Environmental Network was literally at the table when the BIPOC works mobilized after Dr. Bullard's first paper came out and coined the term environmental justice. So IEN was at that table. So tribal sovereignty refers to the legal recognition in the United States of the inherent sovereignty of American Indian nations. And this body of law is called federal Indian law. Although undermined by various acts, legal decisions, and policies, it still stands to this day. Indian reservations are recognized as what can be termed nations within. Each has its own government and sovereign powers to make laws, tax, and most also have their own tribal judicial systems based on this inherent power. What's important to remember here is that tribal sovereignty is inherent. The state and federal entities can choose to recognize or not recognize that sovereignty, but the federal government doesn't bestow sovereignty on a nation. Nations are sovereign because of our relationship with the Creator that predates the existence of the United States by thousands of years. Next slide, please. The kind of sovereignty that we'll talk about, when it comes to Southern California and the Los Angeles County area is Indigenous sovereignty. And this is distinguishable from the term tribal sovereignty because it's not a nation-state recognition of inherent sovereignty under nation-state dominion. Rather, it arises from Indigenous traditional knowledge, belonging to each Indigenous nation, tribe, First Nation, or community. It consists of spiritual ways, culture, language, social and legal systems, political structures, and inherent relationships with the lands, waters, all upon it. Indigenous sovereignty exists regardless of what the nation state does or does not do. And it continues as long as the people that are part of it continue. So this is the sovereignty that Tonga, Satavium, and Chumash people have, indigenous sovereignty. These nations continue to conduct themselves as governments, and there continues to be a mandate at the state level to engage with these nations on a respectful government basis. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk briefly about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous. We're going all over the place here. You can go to the next one, the article. Great. So one principle that, if you had a chance to see the video I discussed and want to uplift here is this principle of free, prior, and informed consent. And really, that is the standard. If you want to be an ally to Indigenous peoples and tribal nations, then this is the standard that we ask that you advocate for. Consultation is one thing, but as Tony Cordero and others have shared, at the end of the day, agencies can listen, they can consult, and then walk away and completely disregard tribal perspectives. The standard of free, prior, and informed consent is much higher, and that is the standard that we ask folks to use. Next slide, please. I want to highlight this as well. Article 25 of UNDRIP, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationships with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. Article 25 is critical, and especially for non-federally recognized tribes, such as those based in LA County. No matter what, no matter who owns these lands, the rights of Indigenous people to maintain and strengthen these relationships for future generations cannot be abrogated. Next slide, please. So I want to shift briefly, and I'm not going to spend much time at all talking about federal laws, other than to just name some of them. If folks have specific questions about federal laws, we can get to those in the Q&A. One of the reasons that I'm not focusing so much on federal laws is because all of the tribes with ancestral territories in LA County are non-federally recognized. So many of the nuances in the ways in which these federal laws apply to federally recognized tribes don't necessarily apply to non-federally recognized tribes. American Indian Religious Freedom Act is an exception. All Native people have a right to practice their religion. This act was created in response to rectify the Code of Indian Offenses that was adopted in the 1800s and that legally prohibited on a federal level Indigenous people from singing our songs, engaging in our dances, speaking our languages, and a multitude of other activities. The National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, many of you are probably familiar with that. That is the section of the National Historic Preservation Act that requires tribal consultation. Consultation is only required with federally recognized tribes. However, it is encouraged with non-federally recognized tribes. And my own nation, the Allyship Nation, was able to use Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act in the early 2000s to protect one of our sacred sites when the Federal Highways Administration failed to consult. So I share that because even though technically these federal laws only trigger duty to consult with federally recognized tribes, they are still tools that non-federally recognized tribes can use. Next slide, please. So state law, you've already been introduced to the California Native American Heritage Commission, thanks to Gabriella's link about the land acknowledgement and that digital atlas. But all of you should become familiar with this agency. Go to their website. This is the entity that you're going to contact to get the most up-to-date list of the elected tribal leaders on the NAHC contact list. And that's going to be critical because if you want to work with tribes and establish good relationships, then you're going to need to make sure that at a minimum, you're consulting with all of the nations and contacts on that list. Next slide, please. These are two really important executive orders, one that was passed under the Brown administration and the other more recently by Governor Newsom. So Executive Order B1011 is where former Governor Brown ordered all state agencies and departments subject to executive control to encourage communication and consultation with California Native American tribes. Agencies and departments shall permit elected officials and other representatives of tribal governments to provide meaningful input into the development of legislation, regulation, rules, and policies on matters that may affect tribal communities. And for purposes of the order, tribe, California Indian tribe, and tribal include all federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes. Executive Order N1519, many of you may be familiar with, that is where the state for the first time officially apologized on behalf of California to all Native Americans for the state-sponsored attempted genocide. Next slide, please. SB 18 was adopted in 2004, and that was the first codified iteration of a requirement for government-to-government consultation in state law. SB 18 was passed to recognize the unique relationship between local government and California tribal government. Recognize that California Native American, prehistoric, archaeological, cultural, spiritual, and ceremonial places are essential elements in tribal cultural traditions. And SB 18 also established government-to-government consultations regarding potentially means to preserve those places, determine the level of necessary confidentiality, and develop proper treatment and management plans. So this is required and has been required under California law for quite some time. Next slide, please. More recently, we have AB 52, which was adopted in 2014. AB 52 recognizes California tribes' expertise regarding cultural resources and provides a method for agencies to incorporate tribal knowledge into their CEQA environmental review and decision-making processes. Under AB 52, California tribes now have the ability to establish, through a formal notice letter, a standing request to consult with a lead agency regarding any project subject to CEQA in the geographic area with which the tribe is traditionally and culturally affiliated. And there's a link in here to this document from a law firm that it provides a lot of good background on tips for compliance and gets into more detail with AB 52. So again, you'll have access to that after our presentation. Next slide, please. I want to talk briefly because both the Department of Water Resources and the California Water Board have specific tribal consultation policies and procedures. So DWR's policy is that California Native American tribal governments and tribal communities have sovereign authority over their members and territory and a unique relationship with California's resources. California tribes and tribal communities, whether federally recognized or not, have distinct cultural, spiritual, environmental, economic, and public health interests and valuable traditional cultural knowledge about California resources. Next slide. And the California Water Board's tribal consultation policy is to develop effective communication with all California Native American tribes that allows for meaningful participation and input while developing and revising the Water Board's regulations, rules, policies, programs, or plans that may impact tribes. So again, we have, from the general to the specific, many iterations of the commitment of agencies within the state of California to recognize tribes as sovereign nations with whom they owe these duties to consult, regardless of status as federally recognized or not. Next slide, please. I wanted to name, finally in this section, tribal beneficial uses. LA County, as many of you are aware, recently adopted cultural use of water as a tribal beneficial use. This is a process that was started many years ago that had its origins from the California Indian Environmental Alliance and the Tribal Water Summit that happens every few years in California. So it's great to see this, coming to fruition in places like LA County as well. Here's the contact info for that individual if you have any questions or want to learn more about this. Next slide. And I also wanted to name finally that California did in 2014 adopt by joint resolution the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that Article 25 and all the other articles about free, prior, and informed consent from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that I shared earlier, you can, in your capacity as an ally to California nations, advocate for those standards. You can advocate for the use of the standard of free, prior, and informed consent on the grounds that the state of California, by joint resolution, did proclaim, and interest and endorsement of the principles outlined in the declaration. Next slide, please. And that was my section. I sped through that, so I apologize. But I'm keeping us on track with our time. our time's going so fast today. So if you have any questions for me, you can drop them in the chat now. And then once Maurice's done with her section, we will go back and answer all those questions together. So I will turn it over to you, Maurice, to talk more about the legal rights of nature and how that relates to water.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Angela. Yeah, I'm gonna, really try to run through this as quickly as possible for the sake of having enough time for questions from everyone. So just quickly, this is a history, according to Western, colonial thought, the history of recognizing the rights of nature within this nation has been attributed to the law professor, USC law professor Christopher Stone, in the publication of an article, Should Trees Have Standing Toward Legal Rights for Natural Objects. But however, I want to emphasize that, as many have shared already, the values of recognizing nature and all of its bodies of waters as a living entity has been and is deeply rooted in indigenous cultures here and around the world. And as Jessa has often reminded us, we are nature, and these principles are embedded in the DNA of tribal folks. Next slide, please. So just quickly want to start with
In Cochabamba, 30,000 people from over 100 countries came together for 1 week in April of 2010, calling for protecting the rights of Mother Earth and creating a document entitled the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth.
Emprender el camino de la armonía con la naturaleza y el respeto a la vida. Requerimos forjar un nuevo sistema que restablezca la armonía con la naturaleza y entre los seres humanos. Solo puede haber equilibrio con la naturaleza si hay equidad entre los seres humanos.
I don't know that we're going to get a specific document that's going to work at the United Nations. What we're getting is this very, very strong alignment among people that this is a very important issue, and I think it'll start. I think what will come out of this is the issue will be part of discussions in national conventions. It'll be part of discussions in municipal discussions. Civil society is going to be activated out of this and is going to get really involved and make sure that this discussion about rights for nature and how to activate it will come out of this. It's going to come out of this conference for sure. There's going to be a lot of people engaged in this conversation.
So I just I shared that because what we want to provide here is a little bit more global history on the movements of indigenous people around the world who have been working very hard to ensure that nature and water have legal rights. As Angela was sharing on the history of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it took many, many years and meetings of indigenous communities and tribes coming together throughout the years to finally have the endorsement and the passage, adoption of UNDRIP in 2007. And I wanted to show the context of how throughout there are various countries, indigenous tribes around the world that are passing the rights of nature. The first was Ecuador in 2008 in the world to recognize the rights of nature in its national constitution. That's huge. So with the understanding that after that passage in 2011, they were able to designate the Vilcabamba River as having a legal right. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. And so these are just other examples of Bolivia being one of those that have passed in 2010 the law of the rights of Mother Earth. Let's move on to the next slide. This is just a graph here of the many rivers that have been designated personhood, the bodies of water from New Zealand to India to Australia. And then there are the different example of the methods that are integrated in the passage or designation of water as a living entity. Can we move on to the next slide? For the sake of time, I'll stop on the video here because we are running short on time, but this is basically the quote there, clearly stating that treating the river as a living entity is the correct way to approach it as an indivisible whole, instead of the traditional model for the last 100 years of treating it from a perspective of ownership and management. And that's what, Gabriela was touching on, the whole fours of a colonization and commodification of the waters. But in New Zealand then granted legal rights to their river as a human being. If we can move on.
It means that the river itself.
Sorry. There are also examples of other tribes and northern tribes in out here in this country. We have the Ponca Nation and the White Earth Band of Ojibwe. For example, the Ojibwe just granted the Manoming law to protect the legal rights of the wild rice that depends on the water sources, on the fresh water sources. Can we move on, please? And then, of course, in California here, which is wonderful, we have the Yurok tribe, which is federally recognized. So there's a lot more resources and support available for this very large tribe to be able to recently, in 2019, declare the Klamath River as having personhood. And it is the first river in North America to have personhood rights declared. And you'll see here, the importance, the significance of that, as has been shared earlier with by Gabriela and Jessa and others, that there's been a reliance, a reciprocal relationship with the rivers. And so what that does in designating the river as a living entity, it establishes the rights of the Yurok people to protect and represent the river in courts, but also to continue that reciprocal relationship and the reliance as a food source for the tribe, as they have been relying on it for thousands of years. Can we move on, please? And so these are just some considerations to take into account. What are some of the various approaches to attending legalhood or independent voice for a river? There's so many nuances that each tribe will think about and decide on their own what are some of the things or implications that may happen when you designate a river as a living entity. And it's solely up to the tribe to decide how that's going to look and whether or not they want to have some kind of relationship or collaboration with the local government entities. So again, it could be distinct for every locale, and it entails both legal and independent voice from the tribes. So if we can move on to the next slide. And speaking of implications and impacts, these are just some of the impacts that it might have, because you're working within colonial systems. There are some impacts. For example, it may be that there is a lawsuit from a government entity with the tribes. And so what it means is that tribe is going to have to come up with the economic resources to defend themselves in a lawsuit, should that happen. So as well, as Angela was sharing about tribal sovereignty, it compromises Indigenous people's inherent rights and obligations as First People to steward their original traditional territories and its resources. Next slide, please. And I want to just end with this, as everybody has been sharing already, language and actions matter. Building that relationship is critical. Proactive efforts to involve all local tribes that share water or land is necessary for true full engagement and honest connections. Respect, demonstrating true respect for all living of life. Restoration, the action of returning something to a former owner, place, or condition, and rematriation, basically returning of the feminine seeds back into the communities of origin. This very old Indigenous concept referring to reclaiming of ancestral remains, spirituality, culture, science, knowledge, and resources, instead of the more patriarchal associated definition of repatriation. And that should be it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marisa. So we do have about 4 or 5 minutes for any questions. I know that we covered a lot of content really quickly. So feel free to drop any comments or questions in the chat, or just raise your hand or take yourself off mute.
Also, please note if you drop questions in the chat and we aren't able to get to them, we'll definitely keep an eye on who sent them, and then we'll try to send a follow-up email with answers to those questions.
Michelle has their hand up.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. Echoing what Michaela is saying, it's a lot of information, and I'm feeling inspired to continue reading and learning about the concepts that you've introduced here, and do some deeper learning. I'm curious, as it relates to our work as watershed coordinators in LA County, if you have any examples of authentic engagement with Indigenous peoples that you think could serve as an example or a model of what that could look like. I would love to hear about that if there are any examples.
Yeah, I think one concrete example that you can look at, and it remains to be seen where it actually ends up, but in the development of the Upper LA River and Tributaries Revitalization Plan, we, worked with the entities putting that out, and some of the things that we said based on their first draft, or what our former colleague Anne Marie Mendoza, whose film you saw earlier, refers to as the Chapter 2 syndrome, which is that agencies or plans will acknowledge the tribes were once here, and then you never hear about them again after Chapter 1. And so we offered that critique on the ULART draft plan, and they changed it. So they made sure that throughout the entire plan, they were inserting pieces about tribal perspective into the contemporary. The other thing that they did, and also that if you had a chance to see the video, you were able to see, shout out to Tree People and Roland, especially because one of the things that Sacred Places Institute has put into every single comment letter, every single public comment we've been in, or if it's the River Master Plan or the Santa Ana Water Plan or whatever it is, has been to include maps that overlay the tribal territories with the watershed and with the water boundaries. And ULART and Tree People are the only people to date that have actually been responsive to that. But that's hugely important because, again, the erasure is a project of settler colonialism. And as such, it's going to be effective, which means that even folks who work in agencies that have the best intentions, you've got to know how to start somewhere. And a best place for that is visual. So it's a small example, but not such a small example because the impact can be so far reaching. Just listen to tribes when they say include those tribal territories in the map, all moving forward. I don't know, do my colleagues have any other examples they'd like to share?
If I may, just an example for me would be like one organization that it's a nonprofit org and BIPOC org, but they are always making sure that if there are no Indigenous voices at the table, especially in meetings where critical decisions are going to be made, they will constantly reach out to SPI and just give us a heads up and be like, look, this is happening, we're concerned, they're speaking on Indigenous issues, and yet there's no Indigenous voice at the table. And so it's really proactive measures that they're taking. And it seems to me that it's policy within, because it's not just one person within this org that does it. It's many of them in the organization that do that. So that's really refreshing and important. And that's one good example. And the last example would be another agency that pretty much has a lot of pull, and they're white. they use their white privilege to support anything that SPI proposes, and they do everything they can on their end to make it happen, understanding their white privilege. So those are my examples.
Thank you for sharing that. And it was a great question segue into our final segment on allyship and appropriation. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessa and Gabriela, and then you'll hear from each of us some additional examples on allyship and best practices.
Hello again. Okay, I'll start us off with allyship really quick. So I'm going to give some brief examples about what allyship looks like in authentic allyship. This picture or image here was taken from Sikru Chawia. And I really appreciate it because it's very informative and it puts things just very straightforward. So allyship, opening a space with land acknowledgements in a non-performative way, and understanding that land acknowledgements are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of being an ally. Creating meaningful relationships with Indigenous people whose homelands you live and work on. Working with tribal families and communities to understand their viewpoints and needs. Some of the examples on this chart are like brand is of no concern. You're taking the time to educate yourself and you're committed to anti-racist work, knowing that it's not about you as an ally, but what you can do for the people you are trying to help. And then I'll go to the next slide. And then a few more examples of allyship is being willing to give up your seat at the table if Indigenous voices are not present. So if you're on a panel in California talking about water and how Indigenous practices impact like our relationship with water, and you notice that there's no Tongva person or Tataviam person on that panel, you might want to step back and think like, hey, maybe I should use the space that I've been given and reach out and be like, hey, are you interested in participating in this panel? Or is there anything that you would like me to say on your behalf? And just making that like the least that you can do. Giving credit where credit is due. And if an idea is utilized from Native folks, they should be involved in how the idea is presented and they should be compensated for that idea. And again, compensating Indigenous folks for their times, work, and knowledge. As Angela had mentioned previously, it's really important because these Indigenous people are experts in their fields, and in much like we would pay experts just who are in their fields, we would need to pay Indigenous people instead of just seeing them as volunteering their time. A quote that we have here that I really liked, it was from Roland in the video that we shared with you prior to this meeting. Roland stated, aside from listening, actually following through with the help you are offering. Don't be a symbolic ally, nobody wants that. I thought that was really impactful because it's honestly true. If you're a symbolic ally, it'll really, it'll damper relations between you and the people that you're trying to be an ally with. So with that, I will pass it on to Jessa.
And so when discussing what appropriation might look like, it might look like wearing clothing to show quote unquote appreciation and respect, such as a headdress, stealing ideas and quotes from Indigenous people and openly, utilizing them without giving us our proper, ups for them, excluding Indigenous folks on conversations and actions about our own homelands is highly disrespectful, and using ceremonial items, including sage, out of context. Also, having Native folks involved at the slightest capacity to mark the box for public approval, which we do see way too often. So as you see in this little box here, examples also bandwagoning, optics. You'll know that you're a performative ally when you're benefiting off of our culture or lands, centering yourself, virtual signaling. In other words, taking pictures with us to say that, you checked the box without saying you checked the box. Your statement appeared after you were called out. Everyone is doing so, so I have to do it. You're resentful about having to do it. Having white fragility and using PRs and brands /publics for the profile management are all ways to show that you are definitely not an ally. And so some positive examples of leadership and negative examples of leadership and why these are impactful are something that we'll all touch on. And I think we should start with Angela.
Sure. I have so many on both ends. As a negative example of what not to do, and it's something I referenced in the film, and Justin was actually here for this moment, so this ties into actually this can be a positive and a negative. So East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice is always such an amazing ally, and as Marisa shared, one of the ways in which they're an amazing ally is that it's not performative. It's not just a single individual there. They really have, as an institutional practice, to make sure to prioritize local indigenous involvement. So as a result of that practice of East Yard, they notified Sacred Places Institute that this LA County Just Transition Advisory Task Force had been formed. And there were no indigenous reps on it. So I got invited, after a bit of a struggle, I was invited. And I invited Jessa because Jessa's Tongva and I'm not Tongva. And hello, if we're talking about a just transition in Tongva lands, I would imagine that it's important to have some Tongva people there. So Jessa and I show up at the meeting at which neither of us were invited to, and that we only knew about because East Yard shared with us that it was happening. And we listened to the agency leading the meeting give a quite flowery, nice land acknowledgement about Savangar and the Tongva people. And it was everything I could do not to laugh and cry, because it's like they took enough effort to acknowledge the Tongva people, but they didn't invite any Tongva people to the table. And when I had a follow-up conversation with the agency in question afterwards, they said, well, look, we only invited industry, practitioners and people involved in the remediation of oil wells to this conversation. It was very limited. And I said, I'm sorry, there were at least 5 environmental justice orgs that were invited to that task force. So can you please help me understand why inviting those EJ orgs to the table was important, but inviting local tribes wasn't? And the response from the agency was, well, they're frontline communities, and so they have a stake in this too. And I was just exacerbated. And I said, I'm sorry, where is it that you think local Indian people live? Do you think that we all live in Malibu or Beverly Hills? Native people, are economically exploited and live in these frontline communities that are impacted. And it was like he never thought about it before then. So, that's an example. And as a result of East Yard's advocacy, it ultimately led to a situation where when LA County codified the Just Transition Task Force, there's a mandate that there be representatives from the Tongva, Tataviam, and Chumash communities. And none of that would have happened had it not been for the commitment of our allies. So I will stop there, and whoever else from SPI wants to go next, have at it.
And I'll share next. For a positive example of leadership, as of recent, we have been having monthly meetings with Hilda Bay, and they have been trying their hardest to identify what needs that need to be met with us and how they help to represent for our words and our needs. And so it's a very new relationship, but from what I can see, they are trying their best to be good allies. And so I want to acknowledge that because they are a well-known environmental justice organization. People respect them. So when they say you need to have Tongva folks at the table, or you should listen to what SPI has to say, people do listen. And so those are positive examples. And I think I want to stick with positive right now. So I'll go ahead and mute myself if anyone else wants to share.
I mean, I can take your negative example, Jessa. I think in terms of a negative example, I'm not going to name the agency, but it's been really frustrating. The Tongva Hashimam have been trying to work with them for the past year, and they haven't been taken seriously, and they've kind of just been tossed to the side and relegated as like, oh, they're the Indians. They're only here when we have to remember what Gavin Newsom said about keeping them included. And that's just been a really frustrating thing. And SPI has kind of been putting our foot down and just being in those spaces, making sure that our voices are heard, and making sure that our tribal relatives' voices are heard. And it's hard because our capacity is so limited as an org and as Indigenous people. But it's definitely, it's moving. I can't say things are getting better, but things are happening.
Maritza, do you want to share one?
Yeah, you think I think I moved ahead of myself by sharing 2 examples earlier, so I'm good.
And I know that we're getting limited on time, but I also just want to identify Tree People as another good ally that we've had as of recent. And I just greatly appreciate the relations that have been made between SPI and Tree People.
Likewise, yeah, for sure. And I think without getting into too many details, because we don't have a lot of time left, the relationship with Tree People didn't start out necessarily amazing. I mean, it had some rocky pieces to it. And as I think, especially, and to name both the horrific shooting that happened yesterday and the recent racially motivated shooting in Buffalo, and that we've just come up on the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, all of those things, and the summer of social justice uprising was happening as SPI and Tree People were starting our relationship, and that is not an easy time to start a relationship between a relatively radical Indigenous BIPOC-led organization and a well-established mainstream environmental org. And from my perspective, the key piece for that was humility and willingness to listen on both sides. That's critical, and I say this a lot. Decolonization is hard. I mean, colonization wasn't easy. It was brutal and took a lot of time to happen. And so decolonization is also going to be hard. It doesn't happen in a day or a month or even a lifetime. And so people need to make that kind of investment and realize that the work really is relational, and it takes time, and there will be ups and downs. And so I'll pause there, and we have 5 minutes left to just hear any final questions from you all, or reflections or thoughts or anything you want to share.
I see Peter with your hand up.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I just want to share. Thank you so much for the presentation that's been put together today, and I will share here among this group that Angela has been one of my greatest teachers in this space. And yes, she's absolutely right. It's been a journey, and part of that was me just repeating to myself over and over again, shut up and listen, shut up and listen, shut up and listen. I also wanted to acknowledge that the entire realm, and there was a lot of information around the whole ideas of sovereignty and the different nuances around that, and the definitions. That's, for me, that took a long time to really completely grok that understanding, and I'm still working through it. So I have to say that for us to be allies, there's a personal journey that we take, because I mean, I was raised in the colonial erasure mindset. I was a participant in it without even knowing it. And so to have to change that mindset of decades is not something that happens overnight. It's not something that happens in a 2-hour training. So it is a journey that continues. And I encourage all of the other watershed coordinators to just keep moving on this journey, and know that it's do everything we can, but also recognize that it takes time. We can't jump in and fix. It's not our job to be necessarily white knights immediately. We need to enter this journey. Thank you.
Roland?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. So I think the phrasing of my question, I think, is coming from the perspective of our group of people and kind of just kind of being involved in these efforts for an extended period of time now. What are some things that you all have experienced that you see is improvements or ways of progress? Because, speaking of our past throughout this session, something I grew up with, for example, with my grandfather being really active in the community, is kind of just the changes that came prior to the generation before him. Like my great grandmother, unfortunately, like a lot of Indigenous folk, when she was growing up, she was told by her parents to say she was part of one tribe, because at that time, that was so long ago, the tribe she was actually part of was being actively, pursued against. So, that was a thing she faced at the time. And that's just an example of one generation later, my grandpa didn't necessarily have to deal with to that extent. But, that is something that weighed heavily on his heart, to the point where he told his grandparents, 50 years later. So, just kind of wanting to know what kind of things have you guys seen changed over your time, and, things that are good that have kind of, improved. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll say, actually, the fact that this session is happening in London is an example of that. I remember, I want to say it was 10, 15 years ago now, or how long ago? 2012 or 13, I think, was when the first Tribal Water Summit happened. And, we were desperately trying to get some of these resources to be earmarked for tribes in the Integrated Regional Water Management funding. And it was a mess, it was a disaster. And so the fact that we've moved from that to the point where we're at now, where, local water boards, including LA, are not only recognizing cultural use as a beneficial use, but adopting that as a standard. And that, the State Department of Water Resources is funding these conversations, and that we have, over 20 people showing up in a very Zoom fatigued world to be a part of it. Those are all big changes that I've seen, even in, just the past few years.
Well, for the sake of time, I'm going to go on to our next few slides. So like Angela said, we are going to be sharing these resources and this PowerPoint with you. So you'll have access to all of these links and supplemental readings. We just wanted to share these resources with you because they're really impactful and they show what good allyship can mean. And it also shows like good examples of what has happened in terms of Indigenous rights throughout the years. And then if you want to reach out to us for any reason, questions, comments, or to collaborate, our emails are on the last slide, as well as our websites. So Truthful, I think Roland we put it on the slide, but hopefully people can reach out to you. For SPI, all of us are available to be reached out to. When we all talk to each other, so if you reach out to one of us, most likely someone else will hear about that too. So I want to leave it there, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's been great to take up so much of your time. I know 2 hours is a lot, especially of just people talking at you. Thank you just so much. And if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to email us or just still drop them in the chat, and we will try to reach out to you in a follow-up email in answering those questions. But thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Mike.
Cool. Good job, everyone.
Congratulations. Nicely done. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
It was just a lot of talking. I feel bad. Nobody got to really have like super discussions because that's always fun, but I know that takes up so much time.
Yeah,
Well, and I think we had so much content. If they'll have questions tomorrow. It's hard for people in the moment. You often get that deer in headlight kind of response from these kinds of training.
Yeah, and I remember from when we did this with the leadership group a little over a year ago. It can be humbling. I mean, it's very humbling, and you start on an emotional journey. So having a lot of participation, I love it when there is participation, but if there's not a lot, I'm not shocked.
Yeah, I think there
Well,
was a
thank
lot
you.
of engagement, even though obviously they had to listen. I think they were very much engaged because this is stuff that they've never ever come across before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and jump off in case you guys want to continue with your any kind of follow up. But thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
But
Do we know
yeah.
what our next one is? And do we have people registered yet?
Yes. So this was a good test run in. Thank you all for dealing with my nervousness at the beginning. So June 1st is our next one, which this was a good experience because I think June 1st is going to be way more people because it's now the public facing ones. Let me check really quick unless you guys rather not be freaked out about how many. I mean, it's not huge, but it's significantly bigger at least. I think it was, last I checked, it was like 50 something. So
Nice.
Let's see. Oh, wait, that's well, I have to make sure that didn't change, but it looks like, oh, okay. Yeah, I think it's about 63 right now. So yeah. But
Cool.
yeah, just let me know if we need to, accommodate for anything by next Wednesday. But yeah. Oh, one thing I did want to ask you all, I don't know if you would be interested or even have the capacity, but right now Tree People, our forestry team is helping with I guess some of the folk are going to try continuing the elders gathering this year. So I don't know if you've talked to any of them, but maybe just keeping that on your guys' radar if, that's an opportunity you would all be interested in or not. But
Is that the San Pedro Elders Gathering or the one in Northern California?
sorry, yes, it's the San Pedro one.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've mostly talked with Shannon Rivers since we're working with him at the Onawekwa Mekok School. So yeah, but yeah, just thought I'd mention to keep it on all of your radar, but no pressure. So
what's the date?
I believe this year it's the October, I have to double check. I think 16th through 19th.
Okay. Yeah, if you can get back to me. If I have the capacity, I'll help any way I can.
Okay, awesome. Well, I don't know if there's anything else that I have, but before I jump off, is there anything we need to go over? just relax the rest of the day.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We got more shit to get into, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you all so much and have a good one. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Roland.
Thank you, Roland.
Bye.
Bye.